The dry season had turned the Serengeti into a graveyard of dust and desperation. In a small pride scattered across the northern plains, a mother lioness carried her youngest cub through the scorching heat, her ribs visible through her matted golden fur. Food was scarce. The herds had migrated weeks earlier, leaving behind only scattered bones and the acrid smell of death. The pride was starving, and the decision they made that day would echo across the savannah for nearly a year. His name was Kali, a male cub barely 3 months old when his family made the choice that would define his entire existence. Unlike his 2 siblings who remained with their mother and the pride, Kali was deemed a burden, too weak to keep pace during hunts, too small to compete for scraps. The pride's survival meant making impossible choices. In nature there is no room for sentiment when starvation stares you in the face. So they abandoned him. The rangers who discovered Kali 3 days later, near a dried riverbed, couldn't believe he was still alive. His mother hadn't left him gently. She had simply stopped, and when he tried to follow, the pride had moved on without him. For a cub dependent entirely on milk, dependent entirely on his family, abandonment meant only one thing: death. But Kali was different. Something in his small body, some primal force that drove the strongest survivors, refused to surrender. He crawled to whatever water he could find, his cry so weak that even the circling vultures seemed to hesitate before descending. He ate insects, small lizards and grass, his body slowly shutting down systems it didn't need to conserve energy. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The other cubs in the pride thrived once the rains returned and food became abundant again. They grew strong, their manes beginning to show the dark promise of power. But Kali remained in the shadows, skinny, scarred, and absolutely alone. The psychological impact of abandonment is difficult for humans to comprehend, but for an animal, especially one as intelligent as a lion, it carves deeper than any physical wound. Kali survived because his body forced him to, but something inside him broke the day his family left him behind. He remembered the warmth of his mother's embrace. He remembered the safety of the pride. He remembered what it felt like to belong, and that memory became a wound that never healed. By the time Kali reached 6 months old, he had become something the savannah had never quite seen before. A young lion, yes, but one shaped entirely by suffering. His body was lean, almost skeletal in appearance, with muscles that had adapted to surviving on almost nothing. His eyes carried a darkness that no young predator should possess. Rangers who spotted him during this period reported something unsettling about his stare, a focused intensity that suggested purpose beyond mere survival. He hunted alone, something that went against every instinct a young lion possessed. Pride lions hunt cooperatively, learning from older members, developing strategies through observation and practice. Kali had no teacher, no guide, no safety net. He learned by necessity and failure. His first successful kill came at 7 months, a young warthog near a waterhole, and even then it was a desperate, clumsy affair. He nearly got killed for his effort, earning a gash across his shoulder that would scar forever. But he did not stop. Every day brought a new lesson written in blood. By 8 months he could bring down an impala. By 9 months he had learned to read the wind, to understand the patterns of prey, to think like a predator. He had become something unprecedented, a self-taught killer, honed by the cruelest teacher of all, starvation and abandonment. It was during the 10th month of his solitary existence that Kali caught the scent. Fresh lion musk, familiar in a way that stirred something deep inside him. His mother. She was still alive, still leading her pride through the same territories she had hunted before. The moment he realized she lived, something shifted in his mind. The loss, the pain, the hunger, the nights spent terrified and alone, all of it suddenly had a focus, a direction, a target. Kali began tracking his old pride with the same methodical precision he had learned while hunting prey. He stayed downwind, moving at night, watching from a distance during the day. He observed their routines, learned their patterns, understood their weaknesses, and as he watched, he planned. For 4 weeks he tracked them obsessively, never approaching, never revealing himself, just gathering information like a general studying his enemy before battle. His mother saw him once, during the early morning hours as she led the pride to a watering hole. Recognition flickered in her eyes for a brief moment, then something else took over. Not maternal instinct, but something colder, territory, threat. She roared a warning, and Kali slipped back into the shadows. He understood then that she did not see her abandoned son. She saw only a rival male, a threat to her pride's stability. This moment crystallized something that had been forming in Kali since the day of his abandonment. What had been pain transformed into resolve. What had been loss transformed into hunger, not for food but for something deeper. Justice, perhaps, or revenge, or simply the need to prove that the cub they had left to die was worth more than all of them combined. By the 11th month of his exile, Kali had grown into a young male lion of considerable proportion. The hardship of his early life had not stunted his growth as one might expect. Instead, it seemed to have accelerated it. His body was lean and muscular, built for survival in a way that pride lions, accustomed to easier hunting and shared meals, could never be. His mane was beginning to fill in, dark and impressive, with a texture that seemed harder than normal, like armor woven from his suffering. But it was his mind that had changed the most. Where young lions possessed playfulness and curiosity tempered with caution, Kali possessed only focus. His gaze never wavered, his movements never hesitated. He had spent 11 months learning to exist on the absolute edge of possibility, and that edge had honed him into something dangerous beyond measure. The rangers who documented his movements during this period noted something remarkable in their reports. This young lion hunts with a precision unusual for his age. He seems to anticipate prey movement with uncanny accuracy. His kills are clean, efficient, and completely lacking in the playfulness typical of young predators. He hunts like he is angry at every creature he targets, as though each hunt is personal. One researcher scribbled in the margins of his report, "This lion is not hunting for survival. He is hunting for rage." The pride, meanwhile, had settled into a comfortable existence. Food had returned with the rains. The savannah had healed from the drought that had forced them to abandon Kali. The other cubs had grown into strong subadults, and Kali's mother was in her prime, leading successful hunts and maintaining the pride's dominance over a vast territory. They had forgotten about the abandoned cub. In the way of the wild, he had simply ceased to exist in their minds. They had no idea what was coming toward them like a storm gathering on the horizon. They had no understanding that the decision to leave Kali behind had created something far more dangerous than any external threat. They had created an enemy who knew their every habit, who understood their weaknesses, who had spent 11 months preparing for one singular purpose. As the 11th month drew to a close, Kali made his final preparations. He had grown large enough now to challenge an adult male, though not yet large enough to guarantee victory. But he was fast in ways that were almost unnatural. He was intelligent in ways that spoke to something beyond mere animal instinct. And most importantly, he had spent the past weeks gathering allies. During his time alone, Kali had encountered other young males, displaced lions who had been forced out of their prides or had never belonged to one at all. There was a scrawny male named Duma, with a limp that made him an outcast. There was a dark-maned younger male called Kovu, who had been driven away by his own father. And there was an older male named Rafiki, who bore scars from battles with lions far more powerful than himself. Kali had not forced them into alliance through strength, but through something more compelling, shared suffering. He showed them what he had learned about hunting alone. He taught them how to read the wind and the movements of prey without relying on a pride's cooperative strategies. He showed them that the abandoned and the unwanted could become something powerful if they refused to break. One by one, they accepted his leadership not because they wanted to follow a lion, but because following Kali seemed like the only way to survive. By the end of the 11th month, Kali had transformed from a starving cub into something far more complex and far more dangerous. He was a young male in his prime, leading a coalition of outcasts, moving through the savannah with absolute purpose. The rangers who had been monitoring his movements for months suddenly lost track of him for 3 days. When they found him again, he was heading directly toward the territory of his former pride. The storm was about to break. The cub they had left to starve was returning, no longer desperate, no longer asking for mercy or acceptance. He was returning with fire in his eyes and blood in his heart, and nothing in the savannah would be the same after what was about to happen. The pride had no warning. They could not possibly have anticipated the return of the cub they had abandoned. Kali's mother lounged in the shade of an acacia tree with 2 other lionesses, her belly full from the morning hunt. Her other cubs, now young males themselves, were nearby, growing restless and playful. It was a moment of peace and safety, the kind that comes to predators at the top of their world. Then came the roar. It stopped everything. The birds in the trees fell silent. The distant herds of grazing antelope froze. Even the wind seemed to pause. This was not the roar of a challenging lion at the borders. This was not a distant territorial announcement. This roar came from close by, from the heart of their territory, and it carried something that made even hardened hunters shudder. Cully emerged from the tall grass with his coalition flanking him on both sides. Duma moved left, his limp barely slowing him down. Kovu stayed right, his dark mane catching the afternoon sun. Rafiki positioned himself behind, cutting off any retreat toward the distant waterhole where some of the lionesses had been resting. They moved with military precision, the result of 11 months of planning and weeks of coordinated practice. Kali's mother was on her feet instantly, her survival instincts sharp and immediate. She didn't recognize her own son. She saw only a stranger, a young male with a dangerous coalition entering her territory with clear intent. Her roar of challenge echoed across the plains, calling her pride to arms. Within minutes, the scattered members of her pride began converging toward the center, drawn by the ancient call to defend. The two young males, Kali's former brothers, arrived first. They had never known real combat, never faced a genuine threat. Their lives had been marked by abundance and safety, by hunts where they learned alongside experienced hunters, by meals that came regularly because of their pride's dominance. They approached Kali with confusion more than caution, not yet understanding that this scrawny young male who had appeared so suddenly was the sibling they had forgotten. Kali did not roar a challenge back. He simply moved forward, and in that movement was all the fury of 11 months compressed into pure action. He struck the first young male so fast that the lion barely had time to register the attack before Kali's claws raked across his face, opening wounds that poured blood. The young lion screamed, a sound of shock and pain, stumbling backward into his brother. The second young male tried to attack from the side, but Kovu was already there, intercepting him with a ferocity that spoke of a predator with something to prove. Unlike Kali's brothers, Kovu had spent his entire life fighting for scraps and respect. This wasn't his first battle, and he knew how to hurt. The two young lions collided in a tangle of fury, rolling across the dust while their blood stained the earth beneath them. Kali's mother charged directly at her son, and for the first time since his abandonment, they faced each other as combatants rather than family. She was larger, more experienced, her body marked with the scars of countless battles. But Kali possessed something she didn't, pure, undiluted rage. 11 months of starvation, loneliness, and focused hatred had transformed him into something beyond normal predatory instinct. He was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of everything that had abandoned him. The fight between Kali and his mother lasted less than 2 minutes, though those seconds stretched like hours. She struck with the precision of an experienced hunter, but Kali's movements were unpredictable in their ferocity. He attacked not with strategy, but with absolute commitment, willing to take damage as long as he dealt more. A slash across her shoulder, a bite at her neck that drew deep blood, a strike that caught her across the face, leaving her right eye swelling shut. The other lionesses of the pride arrived then, and for a moment it seemed like the battle might turn. 5 grown females against Kali's small coalition was a mismatch in numbers that no amount of rage could overcome. But something remarkable happened in those crucial seconds. The lionesses hesitated. They sensed something in Kali that made even their predatory instincts pause, a darkness that suggested this young male had nothing left to lose because he had already lost everything. It was Duma who exploited that hesitation. The limping male threw himself at one of the lionesses with a desperation that caught her off guard. Even wounded, even disadvantaged by his limp, he fought with the ferocity of someone who had spent his entire life fighting. Rafiki engaged another lioness, his scars seeming to multiply as fresh wounds opened, but he refused to yield, refused to retreat, refused to accept anything less than absolute commitment. The battle became chaos. Dust rose in clouds as multiple combats erupted across a small section of the pride's territory. Roars and snarls mixed with the sounds of impacts and injuries. Blood stained the golden grass. Bodies rolled across the dirt in tangles of fur and claws and desperation. Kali's mother, bleeding from multiple wounds, her right eye useless, turned back toward her remaining cubs. She was trying to rally them, to organize some kind of defense, but the damage was done. One of her sons was badly wounded, barely able to stand. The other was being pressed hard by Kovu, who seemed to be everywhere at once, relentless and savage. The lionesses were fighting, but without organization, without the coordinated strategy that had always defined pride hunting and combat. Then something happened that the rangers watching from a distance would later describe as the turning point. Kali broke away from his engagement with his mother and charged directly at the oldest lioness of the pride, a female named Amara, who had been one of his mother's most loyal allies. He struck her with a force that seemed almost calculated, not to kill but to disable, to take her out of the fight with enough damage that she would have to retreat. When he did, it was as if something broke inside the pride's collective will. They had believed themselves invincible, these lions who had hunted together for years, who had dominated their territory without serious challenge. The sight of their eldest being struck down so decisively seemed to crack the foundation of their confidence. The lionesses began to retreat, one by one, not in panic, but in a tactical withdrawal, pulling their wounded with them. The young males followed, or tried to, but Kali's coalition cut them off, forcing them deeper into the territory away from the safety of numbers. Within minutes, the pride had scattered across the plains, broken and bleeding and confused. Kali's mother made one final stand near an old termite mound. Her remaining strength gathered for one last confrontation with her son. The wound on her face was terrible, her right eye completely closed, blood streaming down her shoulder from the deep gashes Kali had inflicted. But she roared defiance, a sound that carried all the authority of a lioness who had led a pride and hunted and survived for years. Kali approached slowly now, no longer in fury but in something almost ceremonial. His coalition hung back, understanding without being told that this final moment belonged only to him. Mother and son faced each other as the afternoon sun beat down on the savannah, and in that moment something passed between them that went beyond the simple violence of predator combat. Kali's mother did something unexpected. She lowered her head, not in submission, exactly, but in acknowledgement. She had made the choice to abandon him 11 months ago. She had chosen the pride's survival over her own son's life. She had assumed he would die in the weeks that followed, that he would become just another forgotten cub claimed by the savannah's cruelty. She had never imagined he would return like this, transformed by suffering into something harder and more dangerous than anything she had created through her own strength. The killing blow, when it came, was quick. Kali did not make his mother suffer. He did not drag out her death or make it theatrical. He ended her with the same efficiency he had learned while hunting alone, the same clinical precision that had kept him alive for 11 months. It was not merciful, exactly, but it was final. When his mother fell, the symbolism was not lost on anyone who witnessed it. The pride had been shattered, its leader was dead, its members were scattered and wounded. The coalition that had moved with such unity through the golden grass stood victorious on a battlefield that they had claimed through will and suffering rather than birth and inheritance. The rangers documented everything. They recorded the injuries, the scars, the patterns of the fight. One researcher, an older man named Dr. Kiprotich, who had spent 40 years studying lions in the Serengeti, sat in silence for nearly an hour after witnessing Kali's victory. When he finally wrote his notes, his hands were shaking. What I have witnessed today challenges everything we understand about lion psychology and motivation. This was not a territorial dispute. This was not a natural challenge between competing males. This was vengeance, deliberate and focused, and absolutely devastating. In the days that followed, Kali solidified his control over the pride's territory. The surviving members gradually began to accept his coalition's dominance. Some of the younger females, recognizing that the old order had collapsed, began to respect the new leadership that had emerged from such decisive violence. The remaining young males either retreated to the borders of the territory or eventually submitted to Kali's authority. But something had changed in Kali that victory could not undo. The rage that had sustained him for 11 months had finally found its target, and in destroying his family, he had destroyed something essential inside himself. He ruled the territory now, hunted its prey, dominated its members, but he was a king built on the foundation of abandonment, and that foundation never allowed him to rest. The other members of his coalition noticed the change. Duma, the limp-legged male who had fought so fiercely beside him, eventually moved on to establish his own territory. Kovu found a group of lionesses from a neighboring pride willing to accept his leadership and left to build something new. Rafiki remained longest, perhaps recognizing in Kali a kindred spirit, another lion whose scars ran too deep for normal pride dynamics to accommodate. In the months following his victory, Kali became something of a legend among the rangers and guides who monitored the Serengeti's wildlife. They told stories of the abandoned cub who had returned to destroy his own family. They spoke of his unusual hunting patterns, his focus, his almost human-like understanding of strategy and patience. Some guides claimed that on certain nights, They could still see him standing alone on the high ground, staring out toward the distant territories, his dark mane silhouetted against the stars. The pride slowly reformed under his rule, but it was a different pride than what had come before. It lacked the ease and playfulness that had characterized the family before the drought. It was more efficient, more dangerous, more ruthless. Cully taught his hunts the lessons he had learned in his 11 months of solitary survival. Cooperation, yes, but the kind born of necessity rather than inheritance. Caution, the kind that came from understanding that a single mistake could mean death. His mother's death had left a scar on the landscape itself. The location where she fell became a place that other predators seemed to avoid. Hyenas that usually scavenged kills steered clear of that termite mound. Other lions gave the area a wide berth, as if the ground itself had been marked by something darker than simple death. Rangers who studied Cully in the years following his triumph reported that he never fully relaxed into his dominance the way pride males typically did. He maintained constant vigilance, constantly patrolled his borders, constantly reasserted his authority. It was as if some part of him was always expecting to be abandoned again, always bracing for the moment when his coalition would turn on him or his territory would be taken away. The most remarkable aspect of Cully's story, however, was not his victory, but what it revealed about the psychological complexity of lions. For centuries, humans had understood lions primarily through the lens of simple predatory behavior: hunt, eat, survive, breed. But Cully's journey suggested something far more nuanced. Emotions like abandonment and betrayal could leave marks that lasted for years. Suffering could be transformed into purpose, and rage, properly focused, could reshape the entire landscape of a creature's existence. Scientists who studied Cully's case became fascinated with the question of how he had survived those first brutal weeks of abandonment as a helpless cub. Lions abandoned at such young ages typically died within days. Yet Cully had not only survived but thrived, driven by something that seemed almost beyond normal animal instinct. Some theorized it was simply biological stubbornness, a genetic predisposition toward survival. Others suggested that the trauma itself had somehow accelerated his development, forcing his mind and body to mature far faster than they normally would. A few researchers even proposed that Cully possessed intelligence and emotional complexity more similar to higher primates than to typical felines. But perhaps the simplest explanation was also the truest. Cully survived because he refused to accept the abandonment as final. Deep in his consciousness, something remembered his mother's warmth and the safety of the pride. That memory transformed from comfort into fuel, driving him forward through impossible circumstances, sustaining him through weeks when his body should have simply shut down. And when he finally returned, it was not as a desperate cub seeking reconciliation. He returned as a force of nature, shaped by suffering into something that transcended the normal boundaries of predatory behavior. He returned to teach a lesson that the savannah would not forget, a lesson about the consequences of abandonment, about the unexpected strength that can emerge from the darkest circumstances, about the terrible price that can be paid when survival instinct meets the memory of betrayal. The cub that had been left to starve had become a king, but it was a kingship bought with a price that no amount of territory or dominance could ever fully repay. Years passed, and Cully's reign over the territory became absolute and undisputed. The rangers who had witnessed his rise from abandoned cub to dominant male continued to monitor his movements, documenting his hunts, his interactions with other prides, his seemingly endless capacity for survival and domination. But something darker began to emerge in the pattern of his behavior, something that suggested the trauma of his abandonment had left scars that deepened rather than healed with time. Cully developed a peculiar habit that rangers found disturbing in its implications. Whenever a young lion, particularly a male cub or subadult, wandered into his territory, Cully would hunt them with a focus and intensity that went far beyond normal territorial disputes. He would track them relentlessly, sometimes for days, using strategies that seemed almost personal in their calculated cruelty. He would separate them from their families or groups, isolate them in vulnerable positions, and then strike with a precision that suggested the hunt was not about claiming territory or resources, but about something far more complex. Dr. Kiprotich, the researcher who had witnessed Cully's victory over his original pride, began to form a troubling hypothesis. I believe Cully is recreating his own abandonment through his hunts. Every young male he drives away, every cub he isolates, every lion he forces into solitude, seems to mirror his own experience. He is not simply defending territory, he is projecting his trauma onto every creature that reminds him of what he once was. This theory was controversial among the scientific community. Some researchers dismissed it as anthropomorphization, the projection of human emotions onto animal behavior. But those who studied Kali closely found evidence that was difficult to ignore. His hunts of young males were never swift executions. They were prolonged campaigns of psychological and physical warfare designed to break the spirit before ending the body. One particular case stood out in the research records. A young male named Mufasa, barely 3 years old, had wandered into Kali's territory in search of a pride to challenge. Kali could have killed him immediately, as he did with most intruders. Instead, he hunted Mufasa across the territory for nearly 2 weeks, a campaign that seemed designed to exhaust and terrify, rather than quickly eliminate. Kali would appear and disappear, allowing Mufasa brief moments of hope before attacking again. He would injure the young lion but leave him alive, allowing him to believe escape was possible. He would drive him toward waterholes where hyenas gathered, forcing Mufasa to choose between death at Kali's claws and death at the hands of scavengers. The psychological toll of this extended hunt seemed to matter more to Kali than the physical outcome. When Mufasa finally died, it was almost as an act of mercy. He had been broken by weeks of terror and isolation, his will to survive completely shattered. Rangers found his body near a dried riverbed, and the wounds suggested he had not even attempted to fight back in those final moments. He had simply given up, surrendered to the inevitable, accepted abandonment by life itself. But the hunting patterns revealed something else about Kali that was equally disturbing. He had begun to show favoritism towards certain members of his pride, particularly those who had proven themselves through absolute loyalty and ferocity. He would provide them with choice kills, protect them fiercely from external threats, and allow them privileges that the other lions were denied. It was as if he was creating a hierarchy based not on natural strength but on demonstrated devotion. Duma, the limping male who had returned after establishing his own territory, eventually came back to serve under Kali's rule. The reunion between the two males was extraordinary. Instead of fighting or establishing dominance through combat, they simply acknowledged each other, and from that moment forward, Duma became something like Kali's lieutenant, a position of trust and authority that he maintained until his death years later. The lionesses of the pride showed interesting patterns as well. Those who challenged Kali's authority or showed independence were driven to the fringes of the group, forced to hunt alone and forage for scraps. Those who submitted completely, who demonstrated absolute obedience and dependency, were brought into Kali's inner circle and treated with almost protective affection. It was a system that created a complex social dynamic, unlike typical pride structures. Researchers began to notice that Kali's pride was becoming increasingly isolated from other prides in the region. Unlike most lion groups, which occasionally interacted with neighboring families through territorial disputes or, in rare cases, cooperative hunting, Kali's pride seemed to actively avoid contact with other lions. Kali would patrol his borders obsessively, marking territory constantly, and would attack any lion that ventured close, regardless of whether they posed an actual threat. The effect of these aggressive territorial campaigns was a slow expansion of Kali's controlled land. Over 5 years, his territory nearly doubled in size, not through strategic hunting or superior hunting skill but through sheer intimidation and relentless warfare against neighboring groups. Lions would simply abandon territory rather than face prolonged conflict with Kali's coalition. This expansion brought unexpected consequences. The increased territory meant more resources, more prey, more water during the dry seasons. But it also meant that Kali had to patrol vast distances to maintain control, and the constant vigilance that had defined his character became almost obsessive. Rangers documented him traveling 40 kilometers in a single day, every muscle tense, every sense alert, as if the territory he had conquered could somehow slip away from him at any moment. Something remarkable happened when Kali reached his prime, around 8 years of age. His mane, which had always been darker than typical for lions in the region, seemed to darken further, becoming almost black in certain lights. His body, though never gaining the bulk of a pride lion raised on regular kills, became incredibly muscular and lean, a physique built for endurance rather than raw power. And his eyes, which had always carried that unsettling intensity, developed a quality that rangers struggled to describe in their reports. One younger researcher named Sarah wrote in her field notes, "Watching Kali's eyes is like looking into a history of suffering. They are not the eyes of a normal predator. They are the eyes of something that has survived the unsurvivable and been fundamentally changed by the experience. There is intelligence there, yes, but also something darker, something that suggests Kali understands loss and abandonment on a level that few creatures ever experience. The turning point in Kali's reign came in the 10th year of his dominance, when a coalition of 3 young males from a neighboring territory decided to challenge him. These were lions in their prime, strong and confident. Having never experienced defeat, they crossed into Kali's territory with the assumption that age would work against him, that a decade of ruling would have softened his edge, that they could simply overwhelm him through superior youth and strength. They were catastrophically wrong. What happened in the battle that ensued became the stuff of legend among the rangers and guides of the Serengeti. Kali fought with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal physical capability. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, despite facing opponents who were younger and physically more powerful, he moved with such precision and devastating efficiency that within 20 minutes, all 3 challengers were fleeing for their lives. The oldest of the 3 attackers, a massive male with a distinctive white scar across his face, was so badly wounded that he barely made it out of Kali's territory alive. Rangers found him 3 days later, nearly dead from infected wounds and dehydration. He survived, but he would never challenge another lion for territory again. The experience had broken something essential in him, a confidence that could not be repaired. What was most remarkable about this battle was not its outcome but the manner in which Kali fought. He did not simply defeat his opponents through superior technique. He seemed to be teaching them lessons, forcing them to understand something about pain and desperation, and the futility of challenging someone who had learned to survive the unsurvivable. Witnesses said it was less like a territorial dispute and more like a predator systematically destroying competition while ensuring the survivors would carry the message of his dominance back to their own territories. After this battle, no other lions challenged Kali directly for nearly 3 years. His reputation had grown to nearly mythological proportions. Young males learned to avoid his territory entirely. Neighboring prides taught their cubs to fear the dark-maned lion who ruled beyond the northern boundaries. Stories began to circulate about Kali in the villages near the Serengeti, tales of a lion so powerful and cruel that he seemed almost supernatural. But within his own pride, something began to shift around this same time. The lionesses, who had always been somewhat separate from Kali's focus on hunting and territorial dominance, began to show signs of stress and unease. Several of them attempted to leave the pride, only to be driven back by Kali's aggressive enforcement of his control. One lioness, apparently attempting to escape, was struck down by Kali himself in a brutal display of control that rangers witnessed from a distance. The researchers began to theorize that Kali's psychological condition was deteriorating. The constant vigilance, the relentless patrols, the obsessive maintenance of territory, the aggressive enforcement of loyalty among pride members, all suggested a predator whose mind was being consumed by the trauma of his abandonment. Rather than healing with time and success, the wounds seemed to be deepening, metastasizing into patterns of behavior that were increasingly erratic and cruel. One night, during the rainy season when the savannah came alive with the sounds of water and life, rangers heard something that chilled them to the bone. Kali roared, not his typical territorial announcement, but something far more raw and anguished. The sound carried across miles of grassland, a cry that seemed to express something beyond the normal range of predatory communication. Researchers who heard it reported that it sounded almost like grief, a profound and primal expression of loss that suggested Kali was still that abandoned cub crying out into the darkness, still searching for the family that had left him behind. After that night, Kali's behavior changed again. He became more withdrawn, spending long hours alone on the high ground, staring out toward the territories where other prides hunted. The relentless patrols continued, but they seemed less purposeful, more ritualistic, as if Kali was going through the motions of dominance while his mind was elsewhere, trapped in memories of abandonment. His interaction with his coalition also shifted. Duma, who had remained loyal for so many years, was found dead one morning, not killed in combat but apparently from natural causes. Kali's response was extraordinary. He kept vigil over Duma's body for 2 days, sitting beside his old companion, occasionally touching him with his paw. When he finally left, guides reported that something had broken inside him, that the loss of his one truly loyal supporter seemed to have cracked whatever remained of his psychological armor. The pride itself began to fragment. Younger lions started to challenge Kali's authority more openly, testing his resolve. Some of the lionesses formed their own hunting groups, operating with less direct oversight from Kali. It was as if the iron control that had defined his reign was beginning to rust and corrode from within. Researchers who studied Kali during this period began to form dark conclusions about the nature of trauma and dominance. A lion could conquer territories and defeat rivals and establish absolute authority, but these external victories could not heal the internal wounds of abandonment. In fact, they seemed to exacerbate them, creating a situation where every success was hollow because it could not answer the fundamental question that had driven Kali since his cub: why had his family left him behind? Some scientists began to suggest that Kali's entire reign had been a form of extended self-destruction dressed up as dominance. He had not built an empire to establish himself as a great lion, but to prove that he was worth more than the abandonment had suggested. Every hunt, every territorial victory, every brutal enforcement of loyalty was an attempt to answer a question that no amount of predatory success could actually resolve. By the time Kali reached his 14th year, his decline was unmistakable. His mane, once impressively dark, began to show streaks of grey. His movements, though still powerful, carried signs of arthritis and accumulated damage from years of intense combat. His sight, once sharp enough to detect prey at impossible distances, began to deteriorate. The ranger who had known him longest, Dr. Kiprotich, now elderly himself, watched the decline with a strange mixture of sadness and grim recognition. I think Kiprotich wrote in what would be one of his final reports on Kali, "This lion's entire existence has been a tragedy written in dust and blood. He was abandoned as a cub, and in overcoming that abandonment, in achieving dominance and power, he never truly escaped the fundamental trauma. He simply transformed it into something else, something that consumed him from the inside out. His victory over his original pride was not the beginning of his triumph, but the moment his decline truly began. The final chapter of Kali's story was approaching, though no one could have predicted exactly how it would unfold. The cub who had been left to starve, who had survived through sheer will and transformed his suffering into power, was beginning to understand that some victories could never truly be won, that some abandonment could never be overcome, no matter how many territories were conquered or how many rivals were defeated. The rainy season of Kali's 14th year brought unusual weather to the Serengeti. The rains came harder and longer than normal, swelling the rivers and creating temporary water channels across the plains. For most predators, abundance of water meant abundance of prey, a time of relative ease and prosperity. But for Kali, the changing landscape seemed to trigger something darker, a resurgence of the old patterns that had defined his early years. Researchers documented that during this period, Kali began to hunt with renewed intensity, but not for food. The pride had plenty to eat, the territory was rich with prey. Yet Kali started pursuing lone lions with the same obsessive focus he had directed at other solitary predators in the past. He seemed driven by something beyond territorial maintenance or resource competition. Rangers found the bodies of two young males who had apparently wandered into his territory, not killed quickly but murdered with a kind of calculated cruelty that went far beyond necessary predatory violence. The most troubling incident occurred near the Grueling River, where Kali encountered a lone female from a neighboring pride. She had apparently become separated from her family during the floods, and she was trying to find her way back to familiar territory. Kali's response was extraordinary in its brutality. Rather than simply drive her away or kill her as he had countless other trespassers, he seemed to take pleasure in her confusion and terror. Rangers watching from a distance documented that Kali herded the female toward increasingly dangerous terrain, forcing her toward deep water where crocodiles were known to hunt. When she attempted to flee in a different direction, he cut off her escape routes with calculated precision. The female, increasingly desperate and confused, finally waded into the river. She was taken by a crocodile within minutes, but Kali remained on the bank, watching, his dark mane silhouetted against the stormy sky. What was most disturbing about this incident was not the killing itself, but the apparent purpose behind it. Kali seemed to be recreating the abandonment he had experienced, forcing another creature to experience the same desperation and isolation that had defined his early months. He was not hunting out of hunger or territorial necessity. He was hunting to inflict suffering, to make another being understand what it meant to be alone and helpless. Dr. Kiprotich, observing from a ranger vehicle at a safe distance, made a notation that would be quoted repeatedly in later scientific discussions of predator psychology. "Today I witnessed something that I believe crosses the line between predatory behavior and pathological cruelty." Kali is no longer a lion defending territory or hunting for survival. He is a creature consumed by trauma so profound that he can only find meaning by inflicting that same trauma on others. He has become a disease in the ecosystem, a predator not governed by the natural laws of survival, but by the psychological demons of abandonment. As Kali's mental state deteriorated, his physical condition also began to show signs of decline. An old injury to his front left leg, sustained during one of his early hunts as an abandoned cub, began to cause him significant pain during wet weather. He developed an infection in one of his teeth that made eating difficult and caused him constant discomfort. His mane, once impressively dark, became thin and patchy, revealing scars that crisscrossed his scalp from years of brutal combat. The pride, sensing the weakness in their leader, began to show increasingly open defiance. Younger males started to hunt independently rather than following Kali's leadership. Some of the lionesses began to question his decisions about where to hunt and how to allocate resources. What had been an absolutely controlled hierarchy began to crack and crumble as the structure that held it together weakened with Kali's physical deterioration. There was one lioness in particular who became increasingly important during this period. Her name was Zara, and she was one of the younger females who had grown up entirely under Kali's rule. She had been born into the pride years after Kali's initial victory, so she had never known any other leadership. Unlike some of the other lionesses who became frustrated with Kali's increasingly erratic behavior, Zara seemed to understand something about her leader that the others did not. Researchers observed that Zara showed unusual patience with Kali during his periods of withdrawn depression. She would remain close to him when others kept their distance. She would participate in his increasingly rare hunts without question, even when they seemed pointless or unnecessarily cruel. And most remarkably, she seemed to show genuine distress when Kali was in obvious pain, as if she understood on some level that his suffering extended far beyond the physical. One ranger theorized that Zara represented something Kali had never experienced in his life: unconditional loyalty without the expectation of reward or the threat of abandonment. Whether she provided genuine comfort, or whether she simply reminded Kali of a maternal presence he had lost and sought to recreate throughout his life, remained unclear. But her presence seemed to stabilize him during his darker periods, to prevent him from spiraling completely into the psychological abyss that threatened to consume him. The turning point came in Kali's 15th year, when a coalition of lions from a distant territory crossed into the fringes of his domain. This was not an invasion force attempting to claim territory, but rather a group of young males searching for unclaimed land where they might establish their own pride. They had no intention of challenging Kali directly. They were simply looking for space where they could exist without constant conflict. When Kali discovered their presence, something fundamental seemed to shift in his response. Rather than the aggressive assault that had become his standard reaction to trespassers, he instead seemed to retreat deeper into his territory, away from the young males, as if their presence was not a challenge to be met, but a reminder of something he could not bear to confront. Rangers observed that Kali spent several days seemingly frozen in indecision, an emotional state that had become increasingly common but never fully resolved. He would move toward the boundary of his territory, as if planning to engage the intruders, then retreat, as if the effort required to defend his domain had become unbearable. This internal conflict seemed to consume him, leaving him vulnerable in a way that no external threat could have achieved. The explanation for his hesitation became apparent when researchers studied the intruding coalition more closely. The youngest of the three males bore a striking physical resemblance to Kali himself, particularly in the shape of his face and the coloring of his developing mane. Whether this was actually one of Kali's biological offspring, or whether Kali simply perceived him as such, remained unclear, but the emotional response was undeniable. For the first time in his adult life, Kali seemed to be facing a mirror image of himself, a young lion with his own genetics and his own path ahead. And rather than wanting to destroy this creature as he had destroyed so many others, Kali seemed paralyzed by the recognition. He did not want to kill this young male. He did not want to drive him away. He simply could not decide what he wanted at all. After a week of this emotional paralysis, Kali made a decision that shocked everyone who had been monitoring him. He allowed the young males to establish territory on the fringes of his domain. It was not a gift of generosity, exactly, but rather an acceptance that some part of his controlled empire could exist outside his direct authority. For a lion who had spent years obsessively maintaining every inch of his territory, this concession represented a profound psychological shift. The rangers who documented this moment noted that Kali seemed almost relieved by the decision, as if acknowledging that he could not control everything had somehow lifted a burden from him. He continued to patrol his core territory with the same intensity he always had, but he seemed to accept that the outer reaches could belong to others, that not everything had to bear the mark of his dominance. But this temporary peace was not destined to last. As the dry season approached and resources became scarcer, tension began to rise between Kali's established pride and the young males on the periphery. Prey animals, following their migration patterns, moved into the fringe territories, and suddenly there was conflict about hunting rights and resource access. Kali, still struggling with his psychological demons and increasingly limited by his physical deterioration, seemed unable to manage the escalating tensions. He would sometimes roar challenges at the young males, then seem to forget what he was challenging them about. His responses became increasingly unpredictable, sometimes aggressive and sometimes almost apologetic in their hesitation. It was during this period of visible decline that Dr. Kiprotich conducted what would be his final interview with rangers about Kali's condition. Speaking into a recorder with the weariness of a man who had devoted decades to understanding a single creature, Kiprotich offered his final assessment. "I believe Kali has reached a point where he no longer has the psychological capacity to maintain the dominant structure he has spent his entire life building. The trauma of abandonment that drove him to conquer and dominate is now the same trauma that prevents him from sustaining that dominance. He is caught in a paradox of his own creation, where every victory only reinforces the emptiness he has been trying to fill since his cub." The end came not in a final battle or a dramatic confrontation, but rather in slow and painful decline. As Kali entered his 16th year, he developed a respiratory infection that seemed to be exacerbated by his worsening physical condition. He lost significant weight, his body becoming almost skeletal as the infection prevented him from hunting effectively. His breathing became labored, particularly in the early mornings and late evenings when the air was cool. The pride, sensing the end, began to restructure itself around other leaders. Younger males started to assert authority in Kali's absence. Some of the lionesses began to lead their own hunts without waiting for his direction. The hierarchy that had been held together by Kali's will and ferocity began to dissolve into something more distributed and democratic. What was remarkable was that Kali did not fight this dissolution. In fact, he seemed almost grateful for the reduced responsibility. He spent more time resting, more time simply observing rather than controlling. Zara remained close to him during this period, and in his final weeks, she was often the only Pride member who would lie beside him as he struggled to breathe. The end came on a night when a storm rolled across the Serengeti, bringing the kind of wind and rain that only happened once or twice a year. Kali was found the next morning by rangers, lying beneath an old acacia tree where he had apparently sought shelter. He was dead, his body already beginning to be processed by scavengers, his dark mane matted with rain and dust. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure, complicated by his advanced age and accumulated physical injuries. But those who had studied him closely understood that Kali had died of something far more complex than simple physical decline. He had died of a broken spirit, of a psyche that had been shattered by abandonment as a cub and never truly repaired despite decades of dominance and territorial conquest. In the months following his death, the Pride underwent significant restructuring. The coalition of young males on the periphery gradually integrated into the main territory, establishing a more balanced power structure. Zara, who had been so devoted to Kali, eventually became the de facto leader of her portion of the Pride, though she never achieved the absolute dominance that Kali had maintained. The territory itself seemed to transform in the absence of Kali's obsessive control. Other prides began to encroach on the boundaries. Hyena clans moved into areas that had been too dangerous to venture into while Kali was alive. The landscape that had been shaped entirely by his will and his trauma began to revert to more natural patterns of predator and prey interaction. Scientists who studied Kali's legacy debated his significance for years. Some argued that he represented a unique case of animal psychology, a creature whose trauma had been so profound that it had fundamentally altered his behavior and capacity for empathy. Others suggested that his story offered insights into the nature of dominance, demonstrating that absolute control could never truly fill the void left by early rejection and abandonment. The most haunting observation came from a younger researcher named Elena, who had joined the study in Kali's final years. In her doctoral dissertation, she wrote, "Kali's story is ultimately a tragedy about the limits of will. He possessed extraordinary intelligence, physical power, and psychological determination, yet none of these attributes could overcome the fundamental wound of abandonment. He built an empire to prove his worth, But the cub inside him, the one left to starve in the dust, never believed in that worth, and so he ruled his territory with the fury of someone who is constantly trying to escape from himself. In the years that followed Kali's death, his story became increasingly famous in scientific circles and eventually in popular culture. Documentaries featured his rise from starving cub to dominant predator. His final resting place beneath the acacia tree became a pilgrimage site for wildlife researchers and tourists interested in understanding the psychological complexity of apex predators. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the rangers who had known him longest. They began to refer to the territories he had ruled not as Kali's domain, but as the Scar Lands, a name that acknowledged both the physical marks he had left on the landscape and the psychological scars that had defined his existence. When young lions were being tracked in the region and researchers wanted to understand their behavior, they would often compare them to Kali, asking whether they showed signs of his kind of focused obsession or whether they possessed the capacity for the kind of psychological healing that had eluded him. The cub that had been left to starve had survived to become one of the most remarkable lions ever documented in the African wilderness. But his survival had come at a cost that transcended simple predatory violence. It had cost him the ability to truly heal, the capacity to love without control, the power to forgive the family that had abandoned him. In the end, Kali's greatest victory was not over his mother, or his former pride, or the countless rivals he had defeated. His greatest victory was simply in surviving at all, in transforming the abandonment that should have killed him into the will that kept him alive for 16 years. But perhaps his greatest tragedy was that survival, no matter how hard won, could never answer the question that had driven him from that first moment of abandonment. Why had his family left him behind, and what could he possibly achieve to prove that he had been worth keeping? The Serengeti moved on after Kali's death, as it always does. New lions were born, new prides formed, new territories were claimed and lost. But those who had witnessed the rise and reign of the abandoned cub understood that they had witnessed something profound, a creature shaped entirely by trauma, who had channeled that trauma into power, only to discover that power could never truly heal the wounds that had created it.